Yeah, so I'm Jacob Carr. I'm with Portage Bay. I'm a lead developer, primarily work with web apps. Uh, so my FileMaker, I've been doing a little bit of FileMaker, but mostly living in the world of web apps for a little while. But today we're going to talk about GraphQL. I don't know how many people are super familiar with GraphQL or have dabbled a little bit in it, but this was kind of when we approached GraphQL, we had a client that was kind of interested in using it, and some other libraries are currently leveraging GraphQL for their APIs. Popular ones like Shopify, I think, is the one that most people think of. Uh, so we were approached with the concept, and none of the team had really like used it. So I threw together a demo, and that's what I'm going to open right now. So this is a GraphQL demo, just kind of showcasing the Graph query language, query language. Basically, it acts as like a middleware between uh, the a database, basically, uh, acting as the API in this case, and basically creating a context for executing like queries against what you would typically do in a REST situation. Um, so that's how they're kind of in comparison linked. So this kind of some quick info. I thought one thing that was kind of interesting. I actually created this demo like last year, and this is some information about the rise of GraphQL to see kind of where it would be at 2025. They're saying, 50% increase. Later looked into the stat and it's pretty close. It's not quite 50%. Um, there wasn't really any like exact numbers percentage wise where it's at, but it's still continuing to grow. So people are still using it. It's still important. GraphQL is actually created by Facebook. So they're the primary creators of this query language for APIs. Um, and yeah, so we're gonna go ahead and just dive right into this. So what I built here inside of GraphQL, GraphQL has the ability to kind of accept or has created a new developer tool called Graphical. But for us FileMaker developers, we're probably used to going to Postman. This is probably where most of us start, right? Um, we find the API that we're going to work with. And actually, Postman gives us quite a bit of tools that support GraphQL, right out of the gate. So that's a nice thing. Um, but when you get into GraphQL, there's some gotchas. We only have one endpoint. And most of the time, this is on a post, but it doesn't necessarily have to be on a post. But that's like the typical practice. Um, and we format all of our requests via a special query language. Um, and for this example, I'm just using a free, these are free GraphQL APIs of people that have adapted a particular REST service to work with a GraphQL type environment to support the query language. And the one that we're using in this demo is just the countries, the free API. If you want to check it out, this is the endpoint. We'll also see this in FileMaker. So from the Postman side, kind of people who are familiar with Postman, um, that probably makes sense to you. In FileMaker, I've just exposed the graphical environment that's available at that address essentially. So they've created a developer environment that's exposing this dev tool called Graphical. And this basically is like the bread and butter of us discovering inside of the API itself, discovering what this API is capable of doing. Um, and I think that's like one benefit that GraphQL kind of like gives us over like the typical REST, we're used to going and hunting for documentation. Uh, and sometimes these APIs that we work with, they have like terrible documentation. You're trying to look for something and you can't find it, right? GraphQL is not like that. Basically, everything is exposed at the schema level. So the schema and the generation of the GraphQL language itself is actually self-documenting. It's creating its own structure from what has been supported in the library itself. So this cool little graphical environment literally exposes all the documentation over this particular API. Now this is a free one, so it doesn't support all the root types. In GraphQL, there's three different root types, or three root types in general. There's a query, a mutation, and I believe the newest one is the subscription. Um, and these are pretty much how we create our calls. A query would be like the equivalent of a get, whereas a mutation would be your post, patch, delete. Um, so everything inside of GraphQL is kind of composed of this query language. And looking at it, it's a little intimidating, right? We can see there's all these kind of different fields that are in here, kind of formats going on. Don't exactly make sense. Um, but I guess that's what I'm here for, to help you make sense of those. So inside of the query language, when we're kind of creating it, everything is stored in this object format, right? And it doesn't necessarily need to have what's called the operation type. So the three operation types that I told you, the query, mutation, subscription, uh, all GraphQL APIs need to support query operation type. And in this case, it doesn't need to be present because that's the default. So in here, we can see inside of our query object from the document browser, we kind of have all these fields exposed to us, right? So when we're creating our query, we can kind of, and there's also a bunch of types that are exposed here that we can dive further in and kind of get a feel for this API in general. But just like at a basic use case, right? So we're diving in, we're coming in, we're reviewing this API, we see country, okay, country's here. We can see the fields that are supported on country. It's a type. And then we have arguments. So this country can support an argument. Arguments are written in parentheses with the code, and then a colon, and then your argument value, right? So this is an argument type. And then within the country itself contains a series of objects. So within country, we can do all countries, right? And then nest further down within the country object. In this case, let's pull just the name and emoji, right? And then we can add our code here. And this, what's nice inside of this graphical environment, it's also linting for us. So we can see that ID is required to find the country. In the case of like continents, the thing in GraphQL is it's very type specific, and that's kind of the nature of GraphQL in general. It's all about types. So let's try country again. I believe country, we can get name and emoji. Okay, so no. And then we can go back to documentation, see that country, in country expects an ID. And this exclamation point right here, when we're reading this, is basically exposing the identifier as required. So within searching for a country field, the code for an ID is required. This language is known as, or this format is called the SDL, or Schema Definition Language. And that's kind of what we're reviewing right here. There's a bunch of different formats this can support, but that's kind of what this GraphQL instance is adapting to. Go ahead and do code, and we'll just do US. And we can run this, and then we have our one country. We're just looking for the country. And we can dial further into this, right? We can get states. And then we can hover over and see, so the country object contains states. States is expecting an object, right? And we'll dial back into states. We can just type in anything here. I don't need to know exactly what's on this. I'm kind of just seeing. But one that came up was a type name. So these are exposed at all the levels in the query. So if we go back to our docs, we can actually see that each of these entries are types. So we can go to state, we can see the state type, right? So we dial in further, do name. What's the docs here? Run it again. And we can see all the states. So this, in general, is just pretty powerful, right? So we'll add query here. What's unique also in GraphQL is in REST, we kind of just have the singular endpoint, or not singular endpoint, multiple endpoints, expressed in API backslash, new user, whatever it may be, the endpoint that we're calling towards, like those have variations, right? And we're fetching all of the data all at once, right? So whatever that endpoint is exposing to us, we're fetching it all. And that makes sense in most use cases. Like REST is still valid and still important, but what GraphQL kind of solves for us, there's a few actually. It's underfetching and overfetching. So underfetching is not receiving enough data per our request, and then overfetching is getting too much data per our request. So GraphQL lets us essentially basically build only the content that we need. And then we can uniquely name those sets of data that we gather by some kind of object or operation name, right? So like this is the operation. We can give this an operation name and call it list my countries, right? It also exposes variables. Like this is all interesting in the case of this graphical environment, right? But how does this work in FileMaker? So I guess let's jump to that. Inside of FileMaker, it's exactly as you'd think. I mean, we can build the same request here in Postman. I actually have a test here of more fancy example, right? This is giving a name. I'm setting a variable condition. I have my variable here. I'm requesting a continent per its code, and then listing details about that continent based on its code name and related countries. We can see the response here. Now we're essentially doing the same thing here in FileMaker. In this case, this GraphQL only supports the query, so we're only doing a query. But this is another example I've set up beforehand. This is a more complex query, and we're doing comparisons. So anybody familiar with JavaScript, there's what's known as a spread operator. And this spread operator is just like exposing this fragment. That's what they call it. This fragment creates this entity here. right? So the compare states entity is being applied to both these data sets that we're doing an entry on. And we've applied a unique alias for US states, UK states, um, based on their country code. And we're passing in the information that we're trying to gather from them, right? And now we're gonna perform this from the FileMaker side of things. So this query can just as easily exist in our graphical environment. We take this and we can test. We can see what our expected result is, right? But now we're ready to take this to FileMaker and use it for FileMaker purposes. So we literally grab our GraphQL or graphical query that we just tested and created, and we can use the UI here to actually copy this if we wanted to, but it's already here. So we'll run the query, and this is just running your standard insert from URL method. When we're, gathering a bunch of information about this call and performing that query. And it's exactly like you'd expect. We're just grouping things into JSON objects, and actually explicitly passing the query. Right, so the whole query string is passed in as an object. And we can see the formatted data here as our call to FileMaker. And there's a few different examples in here. My hope is that we can actually let people have this who are interested in using GraphQL, and kind of pick this apart for their use cases. I think that GraphQL kind of seems scary, but once you kind of get somewhat of a grasp on the query language, it's actually pretty easy and straightforward. So let me give you a couple other examples here. This is an attempt for me to copy the query back for testing purposes. So if we wanted to, copy this query and then come back to our graphical environment, it's not perfect yet. I think it's wrapping more quotes than it. Yeah. So we can delete these, remove these. So my substitution's incorrect, but one cool thing is inside of our calls, we can now, if we didn't describe what this query was, GraphQL even lets us pass in comments. So like if you're working on a team like we are, and you need to describe to the developer who's working on your code base what the behavior is here, and they're not familiar with using GraphQL's query language, we can even pass in comments right within the query itself, so they kind of have a basis of understanding of what's going on in this call. And this gets passed over. So if we look back at the result log example in our query, we can actually see, since I copied it from there, that this code was passed along in that query. And this is super useful for debugging. This example here is what they call introspection. This is basically always available on the GraphQL API that you're interacting with, and allows you to, without the graphical environment, as long as there's some conditions where they can hide this in production. But typically when you start in development, like Shopify does support a graphical environment. You can test to see explicitly what the existing schema of the entire API is, as well as all the types that are involved in this. So we can see the same thing that's being exposed here in the documentation explorer is also exposed in this explicit query call to discover what the underlying schema of this API is. So we always know what we're getting and what's expected to come out of the GraphQL call. So one of the things we can do is we can rename structure. So So with aliases, if we know that in our data set, we're going to have country, and let's say code equals US. And we have in our FileMaker system, um, we have this field for country, but it's not country. Let's say it's, well, I don't know what else you would call it, but let's say it's my country for whatever reason. Um, we can explicitly define the root data set via an alias and then expect our result to be in that specific format, right? So now my country is listing this object of the emoji instead of the return being country, right? So we've forced the data to be what we're expecting it to be. So you can figure out how this would be useful for passing in and iterating on keys that you already have field name wise existing in your current table structure, and then iterating over those based on the actual field name because you've described the data to return that way. So super powerful. All right, so probably for most, Shopify is probably where you're trying to create your connection to. I just wanted to kind of share, the GraphQL or Graphical Explorer is available there. They have a way of installing the graphical environment so you can work with your actual store case. So there's some conditions that you have to meet. So if you actually have a Shopify site that you're working with, there's some preliminary information that you'd enter in first, right, to get this environment set up. But it is here. You can test the same thing that we saw here, schema. And see those outputted here. So this is just a little test front that they give you, but the same thing is held here, right, in the query root. We can see all of these things, they would exist. All these concepts are available on the GraphQL like documentation, right? Or discovering like how the query language works. I guess the takeaway from this is like, yes, it's possible within FileMaker, just as most things are. FileMaker can pretty much interact and work with anything, right? That's probably why most of us are using it. And it seems scary, but you could do it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I did come in late to the meeting, so you may have covered this. I always find GraphQL to be an odd name for what it does. Is Graph an acronym for something?
Yeah, so they kind of teach us in their documentation slightly. Uh, the the way it's kind of functioning is similar to graph methodology. So like there's edges, nodes. Uh, the way it's kind of structured is similar to like what you are if you're familiar with like graph systems. They share similarities in those concepts.
There's a question in the chat. It says,
Sure.
constructing GraphQL with FileMaker text functions is a bit different since there is no equivalent to JSON functions. Do you have any custom functions, or how do you do this, especially when you need to build GraphQL dynamically?
Yeah, so I'm just taking it straight from there could definitely be a custom function or a modified approach to this. In this case, I mean, all we're taking is literally from during our post request, we're just grabbing the query directly, right? So it's already in JSON and it's expected to be in JSON. So if we tested this in Postman, it'd be the same result, right? So we're just defining what this query string is going to be, and it's a valid JSON object. Same with variables, it's just a JSON object. That's all it's expecting. So you can still do the same JSON manipulation process uh, with the queries. The queries themselves are defined by you, obviously. So you feel this fits into a custom function, it definitely could be approached.
So how did you come across this? Like, what made you decide to look into it more and to explore it and figure out how to use it?
It was kind of just one of those, I guess there was a task, right, of a client wanting to use GraphQL, and I guess the idea was there. We were going to move forward uh, with this client, and you know, I like to have or learn about a feature or a tool ahead of
Hmm.
time, especially before going into like building something for someone else or a client. Um, so I just thought, how would somebody approach GraphQL in the FileMaker development or FileMaker environment, and what does that kind of look like? So it led me down the road of like building out how I would imagine this API interaction happening. And since there were so many free examples, I was just like, well, let's build a demo out of this.
Yeah.
Something to share with the team. So
Do you know why they were interested in it? That they came to us already knowing about it and specifically requesting it? If you can generically share the reason,
yeah, so
perhaps.
I believe it was along the lines of integrating with Shopify, right? Shopify
Okay,
being the end
right.
goal. And Shopify has migrated to GraphQL. So
Okay.
I don't know if they're still interacting with the REST API.
Mm-hmm.
At least I believe their admin and storefront has switched entirely over to GraphQL.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the only way you have to interact with them. Um,
I think
you're
I
kind of
think they're.
left to, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say I think they're in the process of deprecating the REST API, and for for sh- for shops that extensively use certain features like product options. If you have a product that has hundreds of options and lots of products with lots of options, then the REST API is already deprecated. But that if you have a simpler store, the REST API still works. But but eventually they're migrating completely to GraphQL. That's my understanding.
That's probably true. I didn't look in to see specifically if they're deprecating it, but that makes sense. I think the power that they're getting from GraphQL is a benefit to them, especially, it's solving probably for a number of storefronts, right? The amount of data that Shopify is probably collecting is pretty extensive. So GraphQL makes sense for those types of users. Very large data sets where you just need to, organize the data in a very specific way, to prevent all these problems of overfetching or underfetching.
How would you use it next, or do you have ideas for future projects?
Yeah, so one of the ones I thought about doing, I thought about doing for the demo was, using it with Git. Git's as or he's using GraphQL or GitHub, right? And just like since I'm doing a lot of things now more on the website, running a collection pool of our commits to a certain library or whatever we're working on would just be useful information for me. And then I can literally funnel it into a FileMaker application, right? So just something that I was thinking of. It's a little more involved since in this example or the demo that I showed you, we weren't directly working with authentication.
Hmm.
Um, but it's still along the same lines. Like if in the authentication flow, certain GraphQL APIs are set up so that the authentication is happening in the request.
Or you mentioned Git, and this is kind of a side topic. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with that. I would be curious to see, is that more of a younger developer realm, more of a purpose-driven decision to go use that? What can you tell us about Git?
So Git's a versioning control. GitHub is a repository location or houses repository locations for code bases. Git's just versioning control, so it allows us to roll back on iterations of code, um, or even have like simultaneous developers working in one code base. It's kind of geared more towards like I guess FileMaker developers don't use Git as much because everything's in an XML structure. Although I don't know if people are using Git for FileMaker. I know that we're personally not. For me, I'm using it for our code bases or components, things more along the lines of like web code.
As an old-fashioned FileMaker developer, I've not used Git much, but I've been using it a little bit and trying to learn it better as I've been doing some Python coding, AI-assisted Python coding, and 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 using AI tools to help me create a front end for calling the Python scripts. I've been trying to use that as an avenue towards learning Git better. Um, I'm I'm only marginally along the path, I would say. So,
Yeah, it gets great in that case. Like, the AI completely screws up something that you'd had working in the first iteration. You just roll back to the previous
yeah,
versions of code. Whereas in
yeah,
FileMaker, we're probably storing a backup of our script and then proceeding to make changes, or the dev production environment, hopefully.